Well, hey, it's good to be with you tonight as we kind of continue this journey that we're going through, talking about legacy. And really, as we talk about legacy, I think for many of you here, as we talk about parenting, as we talk about being married, oftentimes there's many of you who don't really live in that kind of context right now in your life. And I think it's still important for us because, like I said last week or a couple of weeks ago, for some of you, this is the situation you're in right now. For many of you, this is the situation you aspire to be. And regardless of that, I believe that it's worth talking about this because the family is one of the most fundamental parts of our society. And where our society goes is ultimately where our family goes. And there's so much dysfunction in our families, and there's so many conversations that I have with college students that are ultimately birthed out of dysfunctional family life, dysfunctional relationships. And so I think it's really, really helpful for us to talk about this. And a couple of weeks ago, we talked about generational sins. And one of the things that I want us to be able to press into is beginning to stop cycles immediately in our life and being able to stop cycles so that we don't continue cycles of dysfunction. And so whether you're here and you have kids that are in our Resonate Kids program, or maybe you're married and you don't have kids, or maybe you are engaged, or maybe you're dating, or maybe you're just hopeful, right? Wherever you're at in that, I really think that there's some content tonight as we get into this that is going to be ultimately helpful. And regardless of this, what I want to be talking about today is really talking about how we lead people and ultimately what that looks like as we have influence. And I believe that God's called us to be people of influence. And so I believe that God's word has something to say to us today in that. One of the things that I think is kind of this overwhelming reality of our culture is that we live in a disposable culture. We live in a transitional culture. We live in a place where even just ingrained in our mind is this idea that we use things and then we discard them, that there's not much permanence to most anything in our life. And if you're here in Pullman and you've been here for a long time, or you've just been here, maybe you just arrived on campus, or maybe you've arrived in any one of the other cities that we have sites in, and these are just, all these places are places of transition. And we really believe, I think, in our core that we live in this kind of transitional nature, and we use things and we discard this and we discard things. It's just kind of a part of our knowledge of how we interact with our world. And this, I think, applies to relationships as well. I think many of our relationships, we don't think about them in terms of the future or in terms of long-term how we are going to interact with these people over and over and over. One of the things that I think is fascinating, we have a lot of people who fall in love, and I think it's really easy to fall in love. Falling in love is chemistry between two people, right? You connect with each other. You think each other, you look good to each other, right? And this is this easy thing, and it's very natural. But if you ask anybody who's been married for any length of time, staying in love is much more difficult. You didn't require a plan to fall in love. It requires a plan to stay in love. And I believe that, there's like that old saying, of that old lady and that old man riding along in their truck, and the old lady turns to the old man and said, "What happened to us? We used to sit side by side in the truck, and now there you are on your side, here I am on my side." And the old man turns to her and says, "Well, I haven't moved." And this is reality that it's hard sometimes to stay in love. It's like I was talking to someone the other day and talking about living long-term in a city, and they were reflecting over kind of a lifetime of living in a city and saying, "I really thought that the relationships that I have would have more depth with this many years around them." And I think that in that, even as we begin to have this shiny aspect of meeting new people, right? And you're like, "Hey, the Joneses, we met the Joneses, they're great," and you go a little bit farther and like, "Oh, okay, the Joneses," and you're like, "Oh my goodness, the Joneses," right? And there's just kind of this reality that happens in our lifestyles and in our culture where as we interact with people, we have bumps and bruises, we have unmet expectations, and that creates friction. And for us who are almost allergic to the pain of relationships, we don't know what to do with long-term relationships, whether it be in our marriages or with our family or with our friends. I want to talk about that. Because when we think about legacy, we think about a story that arcs across many years, and that's richness in these years. And we begin to think about what it looks like for us to live towards people with a significance and live with a depth that really helps us to understand each other and live in a way where we have a shorthand in each other's life and we know each other very, very deeply. And in that, when we know each other deeply, that always comes with us rubbing the wrong way. And so how is it as we begin to lead spouses, as we begin to interact with friends, as we begin to lead our kids, how is it that we have healthy long-term relationships? And really the specific phrase I want to talk about tonight is, how do you win people's hearts? How do you win people's hearts? How is it that when you interact with someone, they begin to have so much trust with you that it's just this overwhelming marker of your relationship? And so I want to look in our text and into the Bible. I want to look into John 13 tonight. So if you have your copy of Scripture, you can turn there. But tonight, what I want to do is I want to look really closely at Jesus. And what we know about Jesus is that he was not married, that he did not have kids. And so when we begin to say, what does this look like for us as we kind of apply the lens of Jesus into parenting, that at first kind of seemed weird to us. But I really believe that as we look closer, the way that Jesus interacted with his disciples, even some of the language that he uses, allows us to glean principles of influence, and how do we influence other people and win their hearts and ultimately lead people in really positive ways. And so we're going to look at this. This is what we find in this text is that Jesus is preparing for the eventuality, and it's a very immediate eventuality in this of his crucifixion. He is preparing to be put on trial. He knows that he has set up this entire scenario, and as we've talked about with the Gospels, that Jesus sets up the entire story arc of him sacrificing himself for all mankind, including his disciples. And so here we find them in kind of the last few days before Jesus goes to the cross and ultimately sacrifices his life and then raises again on the third day from the tomb. And what there is this interaction. And really what made me think about this interaction in this sermon series was the first two words. And so in chapter 13, 33, let's dive into it. This is Jesus' interactions with his disciples. And I think it's a profound moment for us to begin to see how we can begin to take what Jesus did and begin to apply it to win the hearts of the people around us. It says this. It starts off, these are the words, my children. See, I believe that as Jesus began to understand his leadership in other people's lives, it's a lot like parenting. And there's, I think, a lot of similarities between us leading other people and you being a leader in your fraternity, your sorority, in your household, among your friends, on your sports team, right? In this, there's a lot of parenting things because you're helping people to get to destinations in their life. And he starts off with this. He says, my children, talking to his disciples, I will only be with you a little longer. You will look for me, and just as I told the Jews, so I tell you now, where I am going, you cannot come. And then he begins to press a little bit further, and he gives him something that's kind of this incredible statement in verse 34. A new command that I give you. And basically, this is not something he hasn't said before, but he's kind of talking about the overarching idea of a movement-forming thing that he's kind of landing at their feet. It says this, love one another as I have loved you. Now, this is a statement he's saying, this is what you're to do. And then he qualifies it with the kind of love that they're to love one another with, and that is the kind of love that he displayed to them. So he's saying, I want you to love one another, but I want you to love one another in this way, not in the way that the culture loves, but in the way that I loved you. And he's beginning to expound on what this looks like. Here's it says, as I have loved you, so you must love one another. And here's what happens. So he begins to kind of land the statement. Then he begins to say, this is what it looks like. He says, by this, everyone will know that you are my disciples. And then he goes back and loops it back around so that they get it. If you love one another. And so this is this profound thing. Jesus is landing the last words as a group. It's this amazing statement. It's this socially revolutionary statement. He's telling them the context that these men will start a movement that will transform all of humanity, right? So he's saying the kind of love that I'm demonstrating for you is the kind of love that is radically different than anything else and will draw people's heart and win their hearts. And this is the way that you start an underground movement that transforms the world. And we have seen that this is exactly the thing that is, in many of the cases in our world, has transformed cultures and people around us. And now we get to the next verse. That's verse 35. By this, everyone will know that you are my disciples. This is the key mark, right? And then we get to Simon Peter. It says, Simon Peter asked him, Lord, where are you going? And this is just this amazing moment, right? So what is happening is Jesus is talking about the grand narrative that he's writing. He is God in flesh here in human form on earth, about to accomplish the thing that he gave up his divinity for, came on this earth to be a part of this group of people so that he could redeem the creation that God has put into place back to God himself. This is an incredible thing. He's saying, I'm not going to just take and redeem just you 12 or even just 120 that is going to join me at the end. I want to transform the world, and I'm giving you the means by which you're going to transform the world. And here's what Peter gets. Hey, where are you going? So you said before, hey, where I'm going, you cannot come. He misses the movement-creating idea of loving each other, and he is fixed on, hey, where are you going? So you said before, we can't go where you're going. I'm just wanting to know where you're going. And so I think this is hilarious. Peter's just like, hey, this is right in front of me. I'm just trying to figure out where is it that you're trying to head to? And here's where I think Jesus demonstrates a profound sense of winning Peter's heart. Here's what he does. Jesus responds with a fascinating statement. Jesus replied, and this is such a win the heart moment. Where I am going, you cannot follow now, but you will follow later. Okay, now that might not sound revolutionary, right? And that might not sound like something that's like so profound, but what Jesus does is he doesn't go back to, hey, Peter, hey, remember I told you that you're going to be kind of a foundational part of this whole movement, and I need you to get this statement, because if you miss the love one another thing, this whole thing is going to fall apart. And I'm going back to heaven, and I need you to get this right. Right? That is a way that Jesus could have dealt with this. But what he does is he gets right with Peter, right where he's at. Peter is missing the greater thing, but Jesus is really focusing in on where he's at and guiding his heart to where Peter needs to get. And what he does is two things. He starts off with this idea. He said, where I'm going, you cannot follow now, but you will follow later. Let me skip down really quick to verse 37 after that. Peter asked, Lord, why can't I follow you? I will lay down my life for you. Then Jesus answered, will you really lay down your life for me? Very truly, I tell you, before the rooster crows, you will disown me 3 times. Now, that sounds like incredibly harsh. That sounds like really tough kind of love. But what Jesus does is something I think is incredible, and we can learn a lot in how we interact in our long-term relationships, because here's what Jesus does. Jesus takes and he shows how to win hearts, and he does 2 things. One, he operates towards Peter in a posture of truthful grace and vision. He operates in truthful grace and vision. And here's what he does. He meets Peter where he's at, and he applies this incredible, gracious truth to him at the same time as giving him vision for his life. He says, this is not who you are yet. You're not the kind of guy. You don't have the kind of character. You don't have the kind of grit. You don't have what it takes to be able to follow me yet. But let me tell you what. You are going to get there. And you not being there right now is not a cause for me to push you away. You not being ready to do that, in fact, you denying me 3 times, you publicly denying me is not something that is going to make me turn my back on you and your life, Peter. And this is incredibly powerful. So I want to talk about this incredible grace and vision and how we live towards people's life with grace and vision. So let's start with here. To win a heart, you have to lead with grace. So Jesus replied, where I'm going, you cannot follow now, but you will follow later. And then Peter takes and he says, hey, this is why can't I, right? And then Jesus says, I'm just going to go back to this one more time. Will you really lay down your life for me? Very truly, I tell you, before the rooster crows, you will disown me 3 times. Now, in this, what we see is Jesus helping Peter to understand the brokenness that still exists within him. And how he wants to be this kind of guy, how he wants to be this kind of disciple, but he's not there yet. And there's a distance between who he wants to be and who he is. And this is what a good parent does. This is what a good leader does. This is what someone who's trying to influence someone else is. This is what a good husband does, a good wife does, is there's a gap in all of us. Every single one of us has a gap between who we are and who we want to be. And the people that surround our life and the people that we live our life around, what are they going to do with that expectation gap? What are they going to do with the gap between who we should be and who we actually are? Now, in many contexts in our life, we live in a context, or in many relationships, we live in a context of shame, right? And what shame does is it pulls us back from what we desire to be, and it pulls us back into a posture of fear. But what Jesus wants to do is bring Peter out in that boldness that characterizes who he is. And so here's what he does. He meets him there. He tells him straight up. He's very truthful with him, but he tells them that this is going to not be the end of the story for him, but it's going to be something he ultimately gets to. And this is this grace that he knows who Peter is. And Jesus, right, if we're in Jesus' shoes and there's a guy here that maybe if we knew that this guy was going to disown us, that we would just be frustrated, that we wouldn't want to spend any time with him, that if we were to have this kind of context where a friend would flat out just deny us, that they would say, I don't even know that person, right? The ultimate insult to us. How would we ultimately kind of connect with them? There's been many relationships that have been ended on much less than this kind of thing. But here's what Jesus does. He doesn't step back from the relationship. It doesn't get cold. It doesn't get awkward. It doesn't get this thing where, hey, I know you're going to mess things up. I know that over and over you're going to say, I'm not a part of this movement. I don't know Jesus at all, but I'm going to step towards you. And here's what is key for us to understand. In our expectations, we need to understand that people need Jesus and that we are all still in process. That we are broken and we are deeply in need of Jesus. And when we begin to operate in the people around us, when we operate in the relationships around us, and to be able to know, hey, the default, the expectation I should have is that we're all broken people who do broken things. And when we begin to understand that we are all broken people who do broken things, and that when there's something that happens, we don't need to take that personal. We just need to understand that, here's what Jesus understood. He said the natural thing for Peter to do is to live into his brokenness for whatever context he's in. And in this, what happens when we begin to live our lives and around people and they do things that just are kind of messed up in our lives. And I need us to know that in all of our lives that there are going to be moments where the expectations that we have for what people should do and who they should be, they're not going to live up to the expectations that we have in our mind for those people around us. And when that happens, we have options. One is the option for us to think about how they have failed us. And this happens all the time. We're let down by somebody. They do something that ultimately doesn't lead us or doesn't kind of connect us together. And as they do that, we find ourselves scarred. We find ourselves frustrated. We find ourselves distant from them, right? And what happens is we can just let that be and they can let just kind of, we were like this and then this happened and that expectation wasn't met and it just creates gaps, right? And those happen over and over and over. And what we can do is we can find ourselves, the longer we go in relationships, having more of these scars that lead us to more and more distance. More and more distance. And that is not the way that we're intended to live. We're intended to live towards the people around us. That every year of your life that you would have deeper and deeper relationships, not more and more scars. I need you to get that, okay? The intent of gospel relationships in your life is that you are to have deeper relationships, not more stories to tell about how crappy your friends are, okay? Or how messed up your spouse is, because we're all broken and we do broken things. There's all gaps in those expectations. So what do you do with the gap between what they should have done and what they did? Between what you expected them to do and what they did? Now, here's where joy comes into place. And here's what happens when we begin to think about this. One of the things, we go back, in this time of year, there's so many weddings, right? And there's so many weddings that read out of Corinthians 13. And we see this amazing chapter, right? That talks about the love chapter, right? And in that, one of the things that we almost always bypass is the word always in all of those kind of things, that love is always this, and it's always this, and it's always this, and it's always this. And that word is a haunting word because it tells us that in the context of our relationships, what love looks like is us perpetually going back and believing the best about the people that are around us. Perpetually going back and say, it's not a conditional thing. Always is not a let's compromise kind of word. Always is that I am going to live towards you regardless of the way that you live towards me. See, compromise never builds intimacy. Compromise says it's got to be fair, and fair isn't grace-filled. And so when we begin to think about this always, when we begin to think about how we live as the posture of filling the gap, what do we fill that gap in? And when we begin to fill that gap with believing the best about each other, filling that gap with trust, it begins to shortcut many of the things that go on in our heads. Because many of the disconnects, many of the things that kind of mess us up are things that we think in our head. Maybe they're small things, but the first thing that you can do to begin to build trust is to fill that gap with trust. And one of the phrases that we use around the Weezer household is to believe the best about each other. And so the posture that we are to have in our household towards each other is that we are to have a believe the best about each other posture. Choose to believe the best. Now, I promise you, if you just take this one thing from in the relationships around you, and if you will just choose to believe the best about the people around you. In fact, a significant kind of a survey was done on marriages. And the marriages that had the highest level of satisfaction were the marriages where the people believed the best about the other spouse. Even if it wasn't exactly true, that they chose to believe the best version of their spouse, it made the entire marriage mutually more satisfying. Believe the best. So what happens when we begin to fill that gap with believing the best, and they actually do something that is disconnected? They mess up, that they don't meet that. And that's where we fill that gap with grace. We give them what they do not deserve. We give them something from the very core of it. We forgive them. We allow them to be in our good graces, even though they did something to fail us. We extend grace to them. Now, this is something that I believe is very easy for us to talk about and very difficult for us to do. Because when we begin to think about what it takes to win a heart, I will submit to you that unconditional love, there is no substitute for unconditional love in terms of winning someone's heart. And that looks like applying grace into whatever situation you're walking into with that relationship. That you are to be someone who says, I know they don't deserve it, but I'm going to give them grace anyway. Fill the expectation gap with grace. And when you're able to do this, you're able to give them something that is an unconditional love that they deserve your rebuke. They deserve your coldness. They deserve for you to say, I don't want to spend time with you. They deserve for you to yell at them. They deserve for you to punish them. They deserve all of these things. But instead of that, you give them unconditional love. You give them acceptance. You give them grace. What happens is a cold situation goes into a beautifully warm situation that connects two people together. Now you might say, why? Why would I give someone grace? And this is where we go back to what Jesus did on the cross, what Jesus did for us, that he lives his life, this perfect life, and gives it to us. He sacrifices himself on a cross for us that we might get something that we did not do anything to deserve. And one of the foundational things about Resonate Church is that you understand that there is no way for you to get to God on your own, that there is no way for you and your good works to be good enough for God outside of Jesus Christ. And what Jesus does is it says, while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us in Romans. And in that, as we begin to understand that we've been given something that we didn't deserve, we become people that receive that from Christ and be able to give that from others. And so the same way we're connected with Christ, we begin to connect to others. Now, the thing is, again, we think about this, but oftentimes we don't believe this. Let me give you a quote. It says this. It says, the two major causes of most emotional problems among evangelical Christians are these: the failure to understand, receive, and live out God's unconditional grace and forgiveness, and the failure to give out that unconditional love, forgiveness, and grace to other people. This is this foundational difficulty for us. It says we read, we hear, we believe good theology of grace, but it's not the way that we live. The good news of the gospel of grace has not penetrated the level of our emotions. And for us to live towards the people around us with scandalous grace, we have to be receivers of scandalous grace that overcomes shame. Shamed people shame people. When you live a shamed life, you are most likely to live trying to shame others. And that's the cycle that is dysfunctional in families. That's this cycle that's dysfunctional in marriages. That's this cycle that's dysfunctional in friendships. When you're hurt and you say, I'm going to hurt others. But when Jesus comes in and exchanges that hurt for unconditional love, then you are the purveyor of that kind of love, and you're a connective force, a redemptive force. And this is the incredible thing around us when we begin to think about what it looks like for us to live out this grace in a significant way. So I think that for us, you can never give to someone else that which you don't fully embrace. So parents, the limitation of grace and unconditional love that you can give to your kids is connected to your ability to receive that from your Heavenly Father. And so for some of us tonight, it's a moment where we have to get down on our hands and knees and say, oh Lord, I need you to break into my heart. I've clung to that shame. I've identified with this hurt, that I'm not good enough, that I should be repaying some debt to whatever it is, and I'm still trying to figure out how I'm reaching out for that, but I can never get into a place where I've fully paid off that debt. And so I'm taking and I'm bringing that into the relationship with my spouse and bringing that into the relationship with my kids. Scandalous grace. When you receive it, and my hope is that we begin to live in this freedom of grace so that we might be people who influence with grace and not with guilt. So lead with grace. That's number 2. Actually, let me go back. One more thing. I want you to understand that all throughout the Bible, I was thinking through the math of grace, that we see all these things. The shepherd leaves the 99 to get the one. The pint of perfume that the person breaks over Jesus' feet, and it's worth a year's wages, and everybody goes crazy, right? It doesn't make any financial sense, right? But this incredible act of worship, It's the widow who drops 2 coins into the temple collection bucket, and Jesus says, hey, that's a significant thing. It doesn't make any sense. It's the person, it's the farmer who owns the vineyard who hires these guys at the very end of the day, and there's less than an hour left, and he pays them just like they worked the entire day. The math all throughout the gospel doesn't make any sense, because it's scandalous grace that you receive what you didn't earn. And when we begin to think about this, I want you to think through, am I applying God's gospel math to this situation? Or am I thinking it needs to be fair? Think gospel math, grace math, when it comes into your relationships. All right, next, it says, we talk about this, not only is there a grace, but there's also this idea of vision. When we think about this, and it says this at the end of that statement. It says, but you will follow later. Now, if we're people who are just operating with grace, oftentimes it can create this hole. And this hole is this idea that ultimately you can just be that person who says, everything's okay, I'm just going to give you love, and you're going to go off crazy, and you're going to do all these crazy kind of things. And there's no alignment. But not only that, Jesus gives alignment, that truthful grace in this. But you will follow later. Let's fast forward. Jesus has sacrificed himself on the cross. Ultimately, he revives, and he is resurrected from that grave. He comes back, and he's interacting with these disciples for 40 days. And one of the last stories that we have in the Gospel of John is of Jesus. And he's going and he's interacting with these disciples. In fact, we see that Peter's so distraught that he says, I'm just going to go fish. This is what his occupation was before. Peter is living in shame. He's like, I can't be a disciple of Jesus, obviously, because I messed that up. So I guess I'll go back and fish. So there's a moment, and this is such a powerful, powerful moment. Jesus is resurrected. He's come back. He's interacting with Peter. Jesus is on a beach. He's making a fire. And Peter's out fishing. He calls out. And Peter sees Jesus. And it's so overwhelming. Remember, Jesus has captured Peter's heart. It's so overwhelming. He takes and ties his clothes around him, and he jumps off and starts swimming into shore to see Jesus. And everybody else is like, okay, Peter, I guess we'll just row the boat, right? Because you're doing the swim, right? And so he's swimming towards Jesus. He gets to the shore, and Jesus is making him breakfast. Jesus wants him there. This incredible picture of grace. Hey, you messed up big time. You weren't there for me when I needed you to be there for me, but I'm giving you an incredible amount of grace. And then here's what happens at the very end of this. They're having this banter. And he's saying, feed my sheep. I still have a purpose for you. There's still something you can leverage your life for. And they go back and forth. Do you love me? Yes, I love you. Feed my sheep, over and over. And then it gets to this last verse. And Jesus says, feed my sheep. And then in verse 18, it says this, very truly, I tell you, when you were younger, you dressed yourself and went where you wanted. But when you are old, you will stretch out your hands, and someone else will dress you and lead you where you do not want to go. Jesus said this to indicate the kind of death by which Peter would glorify God. And then he said to him, follow me. Do you get that? The entire scope of that. It starts off with Jesus says, hey, you can't follow me. Peter says, I really want to. Jesus says, you're going to deny me. And then all the way back, the later has become now in the life of Peter. You will follow me. You will become the kind of man who has the grit to be able to sacrifice for my movement, for what I've done to bring humanity back into the fold. You will become the kind of man that has the character and that has the backbone to be able to give your life freely for someone else. I gave my life to you. Now you will become the kind of man who believes the kind of love that gives their life to someone else. this is the kind of man that you will be. And he outlines in such a clear and compelling and concrete way how this looks. He says, here's what it's going to look like. The things that you believe right now that you're not incapable of, because of me, you will become capable of. There's a vision for your life. And then he says, follow me, right? The whole phrase, he says, you can't follow me, but at the very end of this, Jesus is saying, here's what your life is going to look like. I'm going to build my church upon you, and you are going to lead it because you're going to be following me. And it's very clear to Peter at this point that it is not because he is the hero, but because Jesus is the hero. But because Jesus has done all this, he's done everything that needs to happen to form people into the greatest context they could ever live in. That they could be people that they didn't even realize they could be because of Jesus. And this is a profound thing, that Jesus gives Peter a vision of who God can form him to be. Now, this is what happens in each of our lives. Every single one of us needs to have people in our lives that are telling us that we can be the kind of people that God has called us to be. That even though we are broken, that he is the Redeemer. Even that we are messed up, that he can take and restore what is messed up. That we need people in our life that are reminding us that the game isn't over, that the shame doesn't rule, that the things that we thought were messed up in our life are not the future for our lives. And we need people that speak that strongly and clearly in our life. Every single one of us. No one can stand alone. That this is not the way that we've been designed. We have not been designed to try to trek this alone. We all need people in our lives that are giving us grace and saying, I believe in you. And also saying, I believe in what God is creating you in you right now and who you are destined to be if you continue down this path. And what happens is you take a fisherman. The world around them says, Peter, how did Jesus choose you? You don't have a lot of smarts. There's not a whole lot of skills that you have, and yet you are the backbone of a earth-changing culture revolution in this day that has lasted 2,000 years. Why? Because someone gave him grace, unconditional love, and someone painted a vision for his life. And parents, you can do that for your kids. Spouses, you can do that for your husband or your wife. Friends, you can do that for another friend. We all need people in our life, and the most powerful thing is someone that says, I love you just the way you are, but I'm not content in leaving you just the way you are. As we begin to be people who are grace givers and vision casters, this creates such powerful leadership in people's lives. This is what takes and builds depth in each other's life, not scars. And so you can have that friend, and you can have 30 years of friendship, and you bump into each other, and you give each other grace, and you point each other to Jesus, and you watch each other grow in significance. You watch each other grow in character. You watch each other grow in competence. You watch it, and you look back and say, you once were that person, and man, how far you have come, that you used to be like this, and now you're like this. I love that now, 8 years of Resonate Church, that there's men that I've been able to see this progression. I've been able to see them walk through things. There's women I've been able to see God transform. And we have these incredible stories in our church about people who aren't like they used to be. And the grace and the vision of friends around them said, keep going. When you feel beat up, when you feel like you can't go on, when you feel like, oh man, this sin is owning me now, we need people in our life to say, it's not the end of the story. It's not the end of the story. Jesus showed up at just the right moment in Peter's life and said, Peter, it's not the end of your story. My heart breaks because there's people who've left our context and they believe that it was the end of their story. They did this sin, or they didn't meet that expectation, or they had this issue with this friend, and they thought that was the end of the story. We are all a bunch of messed up people. We are all a bunch of broken people, but we serve a grace-filled Savior who's pointing us to say, look, this, I want you to love as I loved, and the perfect kind of love. You're not there yet, but this is the vision for your life. This is such a powerful thing. when I think, parents, about us, and as we kind of get more practical in applying these, here's what I want to call you to do. I just put 3 C's, basically, of trying to help how we shape our kids' lives and how we kind of focus on what this looks like. And the first one is character. When we begin to point towards giving a vision for our kids' lives, a vision for their character, and part of this is where they're lacking character, and we're helping them to truthfully understand what does it look like for them to be men and women that look like Jesus, to be able to clarify, hey, this is what character should be. And so for us, when we begin to kind of cast vision into the lives of our kids, it's character, and it's our competencies, and it's their confidence. And we, Paige and I, when we pray for our kids, we just say a phrase over and over, and it didn't come from us. But we ask God to protect their innocence, integrity, their passion, and their purity. Their innocence, their integrity, their passion, and their purity. So every night, our kids get that. In fact, they start mouthing it. And if we forget it, they say, hey, you didn't pray for my passion and my purity and my innocence and integrity. Like all of a sudden, tonight, this is the night we're going to break out of the house, and destroy all of that, right? You better pray for that, Dad. So in that, man, just to be able to pray towards who they are and be able to point out things that you begin to see in them. Hey, I really see this aspect of your character. Man, this is incredible for you. This is the kind of person I think that you are. This is the kind of person I want you to be, and be able to press into their character, to be pressing into their competencies, to be able to see in them things that they're really good at, things that they excel at. And I wrote down non-comparative competencies. Because when you begin to take and say, hey, you're better than most people at this, or you're not as good, then all of a sudden there's this grid by which they begin to see success and failure. Non-comparative competencies. If you can figure out a way to tell your kids or their spouse how good they are at something, but not doing a direct comparison, it is an incredible thing. I love being able to cast vision towards competencies and my kids. And so we talk about what are you going to be when you grow up a lot. And a few weeks ago, we were hanging out at Lake Coeur d'Alene. And we'd gotten back from hanging out on our boat, and my son just went upstairs and just spent a little alone time. I think he's a little bit of an introvert, right? So he needed a little bit of that alone time. And he came back down after a little while, and I said, hey, Carson, what have you been doing? And he's like, oh, I was just kind of mapping out my future and kind of trying to figure out what I want to be. And I said, well, what do you mean by that? He's like, I just made a list about the things that I want to be when I grow up. And so he wrote down this. I have this up on the picture, maybe. So here's what he put. So he told me a few weeks ago, he said, or a few months ago, he said, hey, you're getting old, Dad. Someone's going to need to take over this thing whenever you're old. And so he said, I can do that. So I think he wants to play drums first in Resonate, and then he wants to be the pastor. So I don't know how that's going to work. So, but the second thing was a surprise. He wants to be a fisher. And for that, I have another picture that may have been like why he decided he wanted to do that. Yeah, there they are. Some big ones there. I told him, he's like, hey, Dad, this is what I want to do. They have to have fish in like restaurants and in grocery stores. I'll just catch the fish and then just sell them to the grocery stores. And I was like, hey, man, there's not a whole lot of meat on that one. So you might have to work a little harder than you think. And so we'll go back to the other one. We'll just kind of progress towards some of these. Then he said he wanted to be a waiter, and I was like, okay. That's the pinnacle? Like, that's really what you want to get? Like, he's like, yeah, Dad. And he wanted to be an artist. I think that's an artist. I want to work in a zoo. Wanted to be a ranger. I was like a special forces ranger. He's like, no, just like a park ranger. I was like, okay, that's cool. You should look into the special forces thing. I think he wanted to be a soccer player, and then a golfer. And so realistic about himself, I guess, That's what I did. Because less people play golf, so you have more of an opportunity to be good. So an engineer, and then the last one, I don't know if you can understand what that says. I think it says Lego factory. So he wants to basically just play all day, right? And so And then I guess he was going to script out which one would give him most money, but when you start with pastor, that doesn't really work well. So he didn't get to that. So, but this is my son, and I get to talk with him, and we get to have this moment where we start saying, hey, what's this going to look like? Here's what I see in you. And it's allowed him to have really a lot of clarity, even at just 10 years old, and what this looks like in his life. But here's the thing. As I think through this, I want to continue to give him hope, and I want to help him to understand that his story is a story that he can continue to progress with. And so let me end with this, asking you, is Jesus won your heart? Has he captured your heart? Because the way that you influence others starts with your ability to give grace and to be a person of hope. And Jesus does this. He gives great grace, and he gives us hope in our future. And what I want you to be is someone who leads out of who you are. Someone who leads out of someone who has had their heart captured by Jesus. And I believe that this is the thing that allows us to have influence, long-term influence on the people around us. That we're able to say, I can freely give grace. I can have gospel math that you don't owe me something. And I can also believe that God's going to create in you something significant. See, Peter didn't ever think, hey, I can make this on my own. But Jesus can do this. If Jesus can rise from the dead, he can make me into somebody that he's created me to be. And I want you to believe that about yourself. Before you think about saying, hey, when I have kids, if I have kids, right now with my kids, I want you to believe right now that Jesus has a desire for your future. Stop the shame. Let me pray for us.